May, thanks very much. Just want to acknowledge all of the dignitaries in the room. I won't run through them because there's a great many in front of me, to the left and to the right of me. But I suppose I should start by just acknowledging that it's Chinese New Year, and to wish the Consul and all of Chinese members of the audience here, Gongxi Fa Chai and Happy New Year, Xin Lun Kwa Le. Someone pointed out to me that it's Year of the Sheep. Actually, it's quite confusing because you go to Chinese functions at the moment and someone will get up and say it's Year of the Goat, and someone will say it's Year of the Ram. Someone told me it was Year of the Lamb the other day, and now it's Year of the Sheep. So it's you can choose whichever one you want, but there was a very nice perspective put on it in Parliament on Tuesday night when they said it had to be Year of the Sheep. And the way they knew that was the bond between New Zealand and China. And anyway, thanks very much, May. Anyway, sheep apparently can't walk backwards, and neither can the relationship between New Zealand and China. So there we go. So it's quite good. That's an awful lot of tequila in one glass. Anyway, let me sort of, I suppose, just start at just from an export education level perspective, and then we can talk about a few things, and then I think, as May said, keen to take some questions, get some interaction. But I suppose the first thing you'd say is export education in New Zealand as a sort of income earner for our schools and our preschools and our universities and all of these things is being very successful. So it's nearly $3 billion worth of an industry. It cross-subsidises. There's a huge amount of activity in our schools and universities that just wouldn't happen if we didn't do it. And it provides an industry for training professionals in that area. So the first thing is it's valued, and it's important. Second thing is we do it well, and I think May summarised it perfectly. There are really fundamentally two reasons why people come. One is the quality of the education they get. That's probably one of the very clearly top and significant reasons. Second thing is actually just safety and security. So, our daughter is at university in Paris, and you'd have to say, given recent events there, that doesn't quite fit the second bill so much as the first bill. But just as a parent, not as Prime Minister, you always care about where your kids are going. You always have concern about where they live and so on. For the most part, New Zealand's been very safe. And actually, as we saw in Australia, where they had a lot of problems actually, and I, in my view, got quite a number of things wrong, you really saw a lot of Asian students turning away from Australia because they didn't feel they'd be welcomed and they didn't feel they'd be safe. I think the third thing is we have to keep challenging ourselves of how we're going to keep that quality up. And it's a challenge, I think, for the universities. A number of the vice-chancellors are here. But the real issue is our university rankings are good. It'd be great if they're higher, and the challenge for our universities is that those rankings are driven a lot off research, and international universities have better research dollars going into them. And also, even though students don't want to hear it, the government actually is very generous when it comes to student support in New Zealand. I don't mean that just because it's our government, I mean any government. They basically, the level of money that goes into the universities to support tuition vis-a-vis what goes into student support is heavily weighted towards student support, which limits the amount of money we can put in other areas. So it is just something that's worth, I think, thinking through. But nevertheless, anyway, we have very, very, very high quality of teaching and a lot of research happening. We have to continue to do that. I think the next thing we have to do is make sure we continue what we're doing a bit of, and it's working quite well, but we can probably do it even better. And that is, I suspect there'll be a lot of students that want to come to New Zealand if they know they can convert that into ultimately residency and citizenship. And I was actually down this morning with May talking to, basically the CEOs of Auckland, really. And the point I was sort of making is that why wouldn't we, having trained someone for 3, 4, 5 years at our universities, maybe even longer, they've graduated, more often than not with, fantastic marks, and they're, have got a PhD, or they're a doctor or an engineer or a mathematician or whatever it might be. Why on earth wouldn't we want them in our economy? Because we know for the most part they're of good character. We know that they've assimilated in the country. If they're taking that step of wanting to be here, I think it's hugely important. So it's sort of joining the dots from the government's point of view. I think it's ultimately making immigration easier. And the government really has been going through a long series of initiatives, if you like, to speed that process up. So speeding the application process up, speeding visa process up, making sure that we're marketing properly in international markets, supporting our education providers when they go offshore. Education New Zealand, I think, has been a Crown entity. There's been more money going in there. It's a range of different things, but that final point around people staying and ultimately having a long-term job here is really important. The other thing I think is that we have to just keep making the case for actually what it means if those students aren't there. Because if you go and have a look at, just take our schools as quite a good example. I mean, I, as I was mentioning this morning, am a prolific visitor of schools. So we have 2,550 approximately in New Zealand. I go to at least one a week or maybe two as Prime Minister. I've been to way over 500, lots and lots of schools. And pretty much all of them have international students. And what's interesting is both those international students are much loved. I mean, the kids think it's, hugely exciting having, a group of students from Germany or China or wherever it might be. They learn a lot more about those countries and they make friends for life. But equally, what's important, I think, is that those schools actually get an enormous amount of revenue off that. I mean, that's the simple bottom line. If they didn't have that money, it's got to come from somewhere else or they've got to go without. I think there is a challenge for New Zealand at a wider level of how we deal with all these issues of moving people around New Zealand a bit more. So it's natural that everyone will want to come to Auckland at one level. Not so much solely, don't mean that from an education perspective, because there's lots of fantastic universities around New Zealand, but I mean, when people come from a migration point of view, people typically go, where I suppose the jobs are easiest, but also where their family and friends are. And so we do see a lot of that, and I think there's a real appetite to see more migrants around New Zealand, living in different parts of New Zealand. And the question is, how can we encourage that or make that happen? So I tell you now, because we've looked at this stuff, like a lot of good ideas, the public policy bit of it becomes much harder when you start trying to do it. So if, for instance, you say, yes, you XYZ are welcome to come to New Zealand and we'd love to have you, but you need to go to Napier, and they say, yes, that's fine, I can get a job there, and then after 3 months they have a bust up with the employer or the company goes broke or something goes wrong, do you force them to go back to wherever they've come from, or do you let them go to Auckland if that's where the job is? And even if something doesn't go wrong and they just decide they want to leave, how much time do you want to spend monitoring every single person that lives around New Zealand? I mean, I think it's a waste of resources myself. So I think we can encourage people to go to places, and it's quite sticky. When people go there, they'll often stay there, and they'll stay for forever. But we just have to accept that, people are going to move around a bit. But the way we could do that, if we wanted to think outside the box and be a bit more aggressive about it, is fundamentally people come in under a points system. So if you need 120 points for want of an argument to come to New Zealand, some of those points are given to you if you are prepared to live somewhere else. So at the moment, we're quite timid about that. So we give people, for instance, 10 points more if they're prepared to go to another part of New Zealand. Well, we could just start being really aggressive and saying, okay, you need 80 points if you go to Wellington, you need 160 if you come to Auckland. And there's a hell of a lot of people who want to come to New Zealand and say, I can make those 80 points, and away I go. So, I think that's something we can at least think through. I suppose just to make a few other comments, because I know you came for questions, just to go kind of on the wider globalisation of New Zealand and multicultural part of New Zealand. So there's no question that in New Zealand's changing a lot, and we can quote you a million stats on this sort of stuff. But the one I think that is kind of the most stark in a funny kind of way is I think Auckland is deemed to be the second most multicultural city in the world if you define that by where someone is born, and if they're not born in New Zealand. And the only one that's more multicultural is Vancouver, apparently. And I think 40% of people who live in Auckland now weren't born in... 44, okay, fantastic. 44% of people were not born in New Zealand. I mean, it's a huge number. It's 1 and 2, isn't it? I mean, it just shows you the diversity of Auckland. So to make all of that work, I think you have to keep making the case of why it's beneficial and what it actually brings. So the immediate stuff's pretty obvious. The food's a hell of a lot better and the cultural shows are a lot more interesting. And okay, you can make those cases, that's all good. And Nadia's here, and I love your food, Nadia, too. When I give up politics, you can deliver me bags, but at the moment I'm never home to receive them. So anyway, it's no big problem. But the bottom line is a hell of a lot more interesting and a lot more fun, isn't it? But I think you have to make a bit more than that, and that is to say, well, I think we have a better understanding of the world and what are the benefits. So when migrants come to New Zealand, it's those people-to-people links, it's our capacity to tap in and understand all that stuff, and that's, I think, hugely important in a two-way thing. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is it depends on what you want New Zealand to become and what you want New Zealand to do. But in my view, New Zealand can't survive, and it never has been able to in the last decade or two, as a fundamentally low-price commodity-producing economy. It's not going to work. We're too far away. There are too many other people that can sort of vaguely produce things in that area. It's not our world. Our world is high-tech, using smart science and innovation. And I would say to people, it's very interesting if you look at the Chinese and what they're doing, because they've got, on one hand, a much bigger resources, but in a lot of ways a bigger challenge. I mean, you're talking about 1.35 billion people. And so when you sit next to the Chinese president, this is what he'll tell you, because it's what he tells me, and that is they no longer want to be a high-growth, high-energy use economy. They want to be a high-growth, low-energy use economy. And what that means is they're going to go away from all of this heavy industrial manufacturing that you see, and they're going to go completely into a high-tech, significant creators of intellectual property. And lots of countries do that. So if you look at the evolution of, say, Singapore, so they started with, encouraging Nike to come along and make a few, running shoes there, and now you're at the incredible end of basically science and technology. I mean, they're not interested in people coming along for those, very low quality jobs. Well, when we went to APEC, the Chinese president got up, because it was in Beijing, and basically said, well, the sky's blue. Well, isn't that great? To us, it was just normal, but to them, they'd turned off the factories for 8 weeks. And the 12 billion or million people or whatever that live in Beijing say, well, why can't we have that every day? And so that's exactly where they're going. So they are going to stop making Apple's handsets and start creating the intellectual property to beat Apple at their own game. Why do I tell you that? Because the second bit of what he talks 100% about is educating people, and educating people at a phenomenal level. They are going to produce, mark my words, Silicon Valley, and they're going to try and replicate Silicon Valley and beat Silicon Valley. And the thing that happened with Silicon Valley was it attracted the greatest minds in the world. Most of the people who live there weren't born in the United States. There's a hell of a bright people who work there. And they're out there funding huge scholarships for people to go overseas and go to these Ivy League universities and return. Singapore's doing exactly the same thing. If you talk to the Singaporeans, they have like 1,000 people at the Harvards and Yales or whatever of the world, and they pay all of their fees, and it costs $1 million, and the deal is you come back to Singapore and work, and if you don't, you've got to pay the money back. But it's really moving up to that next level. And the question would be, what would happen in New Zealand if we said, okay, we need a lot more PhDs, we need a lot more research scientists, we need a hell of a lot more engineers and mathematicians and all of this sort of stuff. And the answer, of course, is the economic productivity of New Zealand would continue to rise dramatically. And that's the only way we're going to compete in even the most basic of products in a way, which is agriculture, let alone everything else. And the interesting thing, and I'll sort of finish with this point, is that notwithstanding what you see from ISIL and all these things at the moment, on a relative basis, of course, New Zealand's one of the safest countries in the world. So, of course, there's risks, and those risks are a bit more pronounced in recent times, but we're far less risky than a lot of other places. And what you are seeing is a huge number of people who want to come to New Zealand. So we're in, this is what I think is going to happen in, is already happening, but if you go forward another 10 or 20 years, if you go to London, there's a lot of Russians and a lot of Arabs there, and they throw a huge amount of money at it. And what's going to happen in New Zealand is the equivalent of the Russians and the Arabs, and there's quite a few of them already in New Zealand, will be very wealthy Asians. And they may not live here the whole time, just like the Russians and the Arabs don't live in London the full time. But they are going to come here, I think, and say, I want to buy something in Queenstown or Wanaka, I want to buy something in Auckland. And once they're here, they won't be able to help themselves. They'll just start investing, and they'll want to buy businesses and develop things. So we in New Zealand's always been a capital-strapped country, particularly for new ventures and initiatives. There's going to be a lot more cash floating around. Now, can we harness it? That's a challenge for us, but I think that's out there. So there's a lot of different initiatives for us to undertake, but the long and short of it is I'm very optimistic for New Zealand, because I think Asia is going to grow to carry on growing over the next 10 to 20 years. We've just got to ride that wave and keep our own Kiwi identity on top of all of it, and we'll do well. Thanks very much.